The courtroom felt colder than usual that morning. High ceilings loomed over tense rows of prosecutors, defense teams, and a crowd of silent observers who had come to witness the trial of Carlos Menendez, a cartel-linked drug trafficker accused of using children's daycare centers as distribution fronts. The case was already being called one of the most dangerous in state history. Police presence doubled overnight. Armed officers lined the walls. Cameras were banned, but reporters scribbled notes, sensing something monumental was about to unfold in Tai. The second row, between two uniformed officers, sat a young woman with pale skin and trembling hands. Rachel Parker, the prosecution's key witness, looked nothing like the fierce whistleblower she had once claimed to be. Her eyes darted from corner to corner. Every creak of a door made her flinch. She hadn't spoken a word since arriving. Seated beside her was her daughter Ellie, just 6 years old. She wore a yellow cardigan and scuffed sneakers. Her small hands clutched a worn stuffed bunny named Muffin, one ear hanging by a thread. Unlike her mother, Ellie didn't seem afraid, just curious. "Do you think they'll have snacks here?" she whispered to her mother. Rachel didn't answer. The judge entered. Everyone stood. Court was in session. The prosecutor, a tired man named Morales, stood and cleared his throat. "Your Honor, we were prepared to begin with witness testimony. Ms. Rachel Parker is present. However—" He looked to Rachel. She shook her head slowly. "She is no longer willing to testify." A murmur rippled through the court. The defense attorney smirked. On the left side of the room, the accused, Carlos Menendez, leaned back in his chair, arms folded. He looked as if he'd already won. The judge leaned forward. "Ms. Parker, do you understand the consequences of withholding testimony?" Rachel's lips trembled. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. That's when Ellie stood. No one noticed at first. She stepped onto the wooden bench, then onto the floor, her bunny still in her arms. She walked toward the front of the courtroom with slow, careful steps, until she was standing in plain view. "Excuse me," she said, her voice clear and small. "Can I talk?" Heads turned. The judge blinked, visibly confused. "You want to speak?" Ellie nodded. Her mother gasped, reaching for her, but Ellie gently pulled away. The courtroom froze. "Your Honor," one of the defense attorneys interjected, already preparing an objection. "This is highly irregular. She's a child. She's not on the list of witnesses." The judge raised a hand. "Let her speak." Rachel looked like she might faint. Officer Daniels, standing quietly near the back with his K9 partner, shifted his weight. At his side, the large German shepherd named Rex, a veteran police dog known for drug detection and courtroom presence, stood alert. As Ellie walked closer, Rex did something unexpected. He gently broke formation and walked to her side, then sat beside her, eyes on the judge. He didn't bark, didn't move, just stayed. Everyone noticed. Ellie looked at the dog, then up at the judge again. "He's okay with me talking," she said. A few people chuckled, then immediately went silent, afraid to break the strange spell hanging in the air. The judge leaned back in his seat, intrigued. "Very well, you may speak, Ellie, but just tell the truth, nothing more." Ellie nodded behind her. Her mother wept silently. The prosecutor, unsure what was happening, sat down and let fate take the floor. And in that moment, innocence and danger, truth and silence, courage and terror, all collided in the form of a child with a bunny in one hand and a police dog at her side. Officer Daniels had seen a lot in his 15 years with the K9 unit, screaming suspects, drug dens, and grieving families. But never had he seen a courtroom so still, so breathless, over a child and a dog. Rex, his partner, sat beside little Ellie like a silent guardian. His brown eyes scanned the courtroom, ears twitching with every shift in the air, but his body remained still, trained, alert, respectful. His presence changed something in the room. The fear? It cracked a little. Judge Langford, a man known for his no-nonsense demeanor and brisk rulings, watched the unusual sight from his bench. "Miss Ellie," he said, his voice gentler than usual, "do you know why your mother is here today?" Ellie nodded solemnly. She told the police about the bad men who came to our place. She said she was going to be brave, But then they broke our window last night and left a note. She read it and didn't talk anymore. A visible chill passed through the courtroom. Daniels tensed. He hadn't been informed of a break-in. Why hadn't the prosecution team mentioned it? The prosecutor looked blindsided. He frantically scribbled a note and passed it to his assistant. Ellie continued without prompting. She's scared because the man in the grey shirt, she pointed at Carlos Menendez, who remained expressionless, was there. I saw him when I peeked out from behind the fridge. Menendez didn't flinch, but the vein in his temple pulsed. And, do you remember what happened that night? The judge asked softly. Ellie nodded again. She looked down at her bunny, then at Rex. They brought in boxes. Mummy said they shouldn't. One of them got mad and said, "You talk, you disappear." Then Mummy pushed me into the pantry and told me to stay quiet. Daniels saw one juror wipe away a tear. Another leaned forward, scribbling notes furiously. Then Ellie said something no one expected. She turned to the judge and asked, "Does he know who lies?" "Who?" the judge replied. She pointed to Rex. The courtroom waited. "I think he does," she said. "When Mommy said she was too scared, he sat by me instead. That's how I knew I wasn't scared, because he knows who's okay and who's bad." No one laughed. No one dared to. It was too pure, too direct. Daniels knew that Rex hadn't been trained to judge people morally, but emotionally, yes. He could sense panic, adrenaline, even dishonesty in posture and voice. Rex wasn't just a drug dog. He was used for victim. Interviews, child trauma sessions, and high-stress negotiations. He was more than muscle. He was instinct in fur. Carlos's lawyer stood up. "Your Honor," he said sharply, "this is clearly anecdotal and coming from a 6-year-old child. This is emotional manipulation." The judge shot him a glare. "Counselor, sit down." He did then, as if moved by some invisible current. Rex rose slowly and turned, not to the judge, not to Ellie, but directly toward Carlos Menendez. He stared. He didn't growl, didn't bark, just stared. For a long, heavy 5 seconds, and Carlos looked away. The moment landed like thunder. Ellie, noticing, whispered to the judge, "He doesn't like him. I don't either." Gasps rippled through the benches. One juror covered her mouth. Even Rachel. Parker, seated behind them, began to shake as silent tears ran down her cheeks. The judge, stunned into silence, finally spoke. "We will recess briefly before further testimony." The gavel hit the block. The room exhaled. Daniels walked over and gave Ellie a gentle nod. "Rex likes you," he said. Ellie smiled and petted Rex's head. "He makes it feel like sunlight even when it's cloudy." Daniels didn't respond. He just stood there, watching a 6-year-old girl stand taller than men with guns and scars. The courtroom, once buzzing with whispers and rustling papers, was now gripped by a deep and uneasy silence. When the gavel struck and Judge Langford called for a 15-minute recess, most people expected the spell to break. But it didn't. Even as the attorneys gathered in corners, whispering fast and low, and bailiffs moved about with stiff professionalism, the air remained heavy, held together by the words of a 6-year-old girl and the silent authority of a German shepherd. Ellie sat quietly in the hallway outside the courtroom, swinging her feet as she clutched Muffin, her stuffed bunny tighter than ever. Officer Daniels crouched nearby, checking Rex's harness and scanning the crowd. Though no threats had been made inside the courtroom, the undercurrent of danger hadn't left. If anything, it had grown sharper, more precise. Ellie looked at Rex and whispered, "Do you think I said too much?" Rex tilted his head and placed his chin gently on her lap. Daniels didn't interfere. He knew that sometimes the dog answered in ways no human ever could. Inside the courtroom, Assistant District Attorney Morales paced furiously. "We had no idea about the break-in," he hissed at the lead investigator. "That should have been reported immediately." "I'm telling you, she didn't say a word," the officer replied. "No calls, no texts, nothing. She was paralyzed with fear." "Now her daughter's on the stand and she's winning over the entire jury," Morales muttered. "That's not just testimony. That's storytelling. That's something the defense can't counter." Meanwhile, the defense attorneys were panicking too. "This changes everything," one said to another. "We were prepared for the mother's testimony, but not this. You can't discredit a child without looking like a monster. Carlos Menendez, the accused, sat motionless at the defense table, but beneath the surface something cold and calculating churned. He turned to his attorney. "Make it stop," he said under his breath. "I don't care how. I want it shut down." The attorney swallowed. "There's not much we can do while the judge is indulging this circus." Carlos leaned in closer, eyes narrowing. "Then make the circus burn." The recess ended. People filed back into the courtroom slowly. The judge returned to the bench, brows tight with concentration. Ellie, escorted gently by a female officer, took the stand again. This time seated properly in the witness box, Muffin in her arms and Rex lying by her feet, calm as ever. The judge leaned forward. "Miss Ellie, thank you for your patience. Do you remember what you were telling us?" "Yes," she said, voice steady. "I was saying what happened when the men came to our house. I didn't tell everything yet." The court held its breath. Ellie continued. "After Mommy told them to leave, one man, he had a scar under his eye, said she had to keep the chain moving. Mommy said she was done helping them. He told her she didn't get to quit." That detail made several heads turn. The phrase, "keep the chain moving," had come up in previous wiretaps involving the Menendez operation, but it had never been released to the public. "How do you know that phrase, Ellie?" the judge asked carefully. "I heard it. I was hiding behind the trash can in the kitchen. They didn't know I was there." The prosecutor blinked. That was corroboration, unsolicited from a child, of a key term used by cartel runners. And what did they do then? One of them pushed Mommy. She didn't fall, but she looked scared. That's when I saw the dog come back in. The courtroom paused. "The dog?" "Dog?" the judge asked. "You mean Rex?" Ellie shook her head. "No, they had a dog too, a mean one. It barked at Mommy and tried to bite her coat. One man said, 'See? Even the dog knows who's lying.'" A wave of discomfort rolled through the courtroom. Even Rex stirred. The defense attorney jumped to his feet. "Objection! Relevance! This is turning into a fantasy." The judge didn't flinch. "Overruled." Ellie looked at Carlos directly. For a moment their eyes locked. And then she said, "But their dog barked at Mommy. Rex barked at him. She..." pointed at Carlos. The jury gasped. The judge froze. Rex, unmoving, let out a low growl. The courtroom was no longer a stage for arguments. It had become a battlefield of instincts and truths, and a little girl had just fired the first shot. The air in the courtroom was so thick with tension that no one dared to breathe too deeply. Ellie's last words, "Rex barked at him," echoed in the room like a gunshot. Her small finger still pointed at Carlos Menendez, who now sat utterly still, his face unreadable. Judge Langford leaned back slowly in his chair, studying the scene before him. "Miss Ellie," he said, his voice unusually quiet, "are you absolutely sure about what you saw?" Ellie didn't hesitate. "Yes, Your Honor. The other dog growled at my mommy. But Rex..." She looked down and placed her hand on the police dog's back. "Ooh," he barked at him. "And Rex only barks at bad people." From his seat, Officer Daniels clenched his jaw. He hadn't trained Rex to recognize evil, but the dog's instincts, honed from years of field work, were sharper than any polygraph. And today, it was as if the dog had become judge, jury, and moral compass. "Objection," the defense attorney said, finally regaining his voice. "This is a child's interpretation of a trained animal's behavior. It's emotional speculation. The dog isn't qualified to testify." "Neither is fear," Judge Langford replied without missing a beat. "But it's real." The prosecutor, Morales, stood slowly. "Your Honor, if I may." "Proceed," said the judge. Morales walked to the front of the court and crouched near the witness stand, lowering himself to Ellie's eye level. "Ellie, I need to ask you something important. Did anyone ever tell you what to say today?" Ellie shook her head. "No. Mommy said we weren't going to talk anymore. She cried all night. Did anyone promise you anything if you said something?" "In court?" "No," Ellie said simply. "I wanted to say something because Mommy was too scared. I'm not scared, because Rex sat by me." Morales paused. "And why does that matter?" Ellie looked up. Her voice lowered. "Because he smells the truth. He sat next to me because I didn't lie. That was it. That was the moment. Not dramatic, not loud, but something electric shifted through the courtroom. Jurors leaned forward. Spectators blinked. Even the reporters, scribbling madly, seemed to hesitate mid-stroke. It was the kind of sentence that no adult could have scripted. Pure, raw, uncoached. He smells the truth. A line that would be. Printed on front pages by morning, Carlos Menendez shifted in his chair. His attorney whispered something, but Carlos waved him off. His jaw clenched, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the table, a beat too fast, too anxious. Rachel Parker, Ellie's mother, buried her face in her hands and wept. Then Ellie did something no one saw coming. She turned to her mother. "Mommy," she said softly, "you don't have to be afraid anymore. I told them what happened. Now we don't have to hide." The sound of Rachel's sobbing grew louder, and then, trembling, she stood up. The judge looked to the bailiffs, unsure if intervention was needed, but he held off. Rachel stepped toward the witness box. "Your Honor, I'd like to speak now." Gasps rippled through the gallery. The defense attorney immediately objected. "No, Your Honor, this is emotional chaos. This witness previously refused to testify." "Motion denied," Judge Langford said firmly. "The witness may approach." Rachel took a breath that sounded like it came from the bottom of her soul. "I was afraid. I've been afraid for so long, but my daughter. She reminded me what courage looks like." She turned toward Carlos. "I saw you. I saw everything. The night you brought the crates, I saw you give money to the owner of the daycare. I saw the drugs hidden inside the toys. I saw your men threaten my daughter when I said I wanted out." Carlos's eyes narrowed, but he didn't speak. Rachel's voice cracked. "I stayed quiet to protect her, but I almost lost her anyway." She reached for Ellie's hand. "Never again." And there it was, a mother's return to her voice, a child's faith in a dog, and a criminal operation beginning to unravel, not from a sting or a raid, but from the quiet bravery of a little girl who believed a dog could smell lies. And maybe, just maybe, she was right. The courtroom was no longer just a legal battleground. It had become a live wire of human emotion. At its center stood a woman who had found her voice and a child who never lost hers. Rachel Parker sat beside Ellie on the witness stand, holding her daughter's hand as if afraid to let go again. Across the courtroom, Carlos Menendez sat frozen in his seat. The calm, smug expression he had worn throughout the trial had disappeared. In its place, cold calculation and just the tiniest hint of fear. The judge leaned forward. "Ms. Parker, are you confirming that you directly witnessed illegal narcotics being transported through the daycare facility associated with Mr. Menendez?" Rachel nodded, steady this time. "Yes, Your Honor. I saw it with my own eyes." "And you're willing to testify under oath?" "I am." The defense team was unraveling fast. One of the attorneys leaned over to Carlos. "We need to consider a mistrial motion. The emotional manipulation, the child, the dog, it's chaos." Carlos didn't respond. He was staring at Rachel, but more than that, he was calculating risks. Not about the trial, he had backup plans for that. He was thinking about containment. He turned to whisper, "If she keeps talking, things fall apart." Behind the scenes, the judge signaled to the bailiff. Officer Daniels stood up, tension in his frame. Rex stayed seated, eyes fixed like a statue. He could smell adrenaline, he could smell panic. Then Rachel continued, "I helped them at first, not because I wanted to, but because I had no choice. They used the kids as shields. Said if I didn't, let the crates through, they'd make sure my daughter disappeared." There was a collective gasp. Rachel continued. "One of the men, he had a snake tattoo behind his ear, said he'd feed her to the desert. I didn't even know what that meant, but I knew it wasn't just a threat." A juror visibly shuddered. Another placed a hand over her chest. Carlos stood up suddenly. The judge pounded the gavel. "Mr. Menendez, you will remain seated." Carlos raised his hands, smirking faintly. "Just stretching, Your Honor." But Daniels knew what that look meant. He touched the handle of his taser, a quiet warning. Carlos sat back down slowly. Rachel pointed at him. He was the one who gave the orders. He didn't always come in person, but when he did, everything went silent. The men who acted like monsters stood straighter when he walked in. I've seen fear, but they feared him. Judge Langford adjusted his glasses. And you're willing to identify others in his organization? Yes, Rachel said, but only if my daughter is protected. She's already been through too much. Daniels finally spoke up. We can arrange protective custody. They'll be guarded day and night. I'll stay on the detail myself. Rachel looked at him with watery eyes. You'd do that for us? Daniels gave a small nod. You've already done more than most adults would. Your daughter, she's the one who lit the match. Just then, Ellie whispered something to her mother. Rachel smiled and looked back at the judge. She wants to say one more thing. The judge raised an eyebrow. Go ahead, Ellie. Ellie stood, letting go of her mother's hand. She looked straight at Carlos. You told Mommy you were the biggest monster, she said, but you're not. Monsters are scary forever. You're just a bully. And bullies don't win when the dog barks, the jury murmured. Even the court reporter paused for a second before continuing to type. Carlos's knuckles turned white around the armrests. The judge called a 10-minute recess, but no one moved right away. The atmosphere had shifted completely. This was no longer a trial Carlos could control. The cracks were widening, the lies were unraveling, and a 6-year-old girl had just delivered a line that no one in that courtroom would ever forget. 10 minutes. Into the recess. No one had truly rested. Carlos Menendez sat at the defense table, fingers tapping a slow, deliberate rhythm against the polished oak. His mind wasn't on the trial anymore. It was elsewhere, deep within the network of loyalties. He had spent years constructing, and now piece by piece, it was falling apart in front of strangers, and a 6-year-old child with a stuffed bunny, and a dog that didn't bark unless it mattered. In a private corner outside the courtroom, Assistant DA Morales leaned toward Officer Daniels. She named others, Morales whispered. The man with the scar under his eye and the one with the snake tattoo, both of them match names from our surveillance board. We're finally getting connections. Daniels nodded, grimly, but it's dangerous now for both of them. She broke the chain of silence. Someone's going to try and make an example. As if on cue, his phone buzzed. A message from another officer. Surveillance team saw 2 unknowns casing the courthouse parking structure. Same tattoos. One disappeared when backup arrived. Daniels showed the message to Morales. The DA's face drained of color. They're already here, Morales muttered. They knew the second she opened her mouth. Daniels looked over his shoulder. Inside, Ellie was showing muffin to a court officer, giggling quietly like none of this was real. But it was. And the walls were closing in. Back in the courtroom, Judge Langford re-entered the chamber. Court is now back in session. Rachel returned to the witness stand. Ellie sat with Rex in the front row. He hadn't moved from her side once. Morales stood. Your Honor, before we resume direct questioning, the state would like to recall a witness for rebuttal, Officer Darren Graves, formerly of the Narcotics Task Force. Murmurs spread. Graves had testified briefly during the opening of the case. His testimony had been clean, uncontroversial, until now. The defense lawyer leaned toward Carlos. What's Graves doing back up there? Carlos's stare hardened. He better not forget who paid for his boat. When Officer Graves took the stand, he looked stiff, sweating slightly, uncomfortable in his uniform, as if it had started to itch. Morales didn't ease in. Officer Graves, he began. Do you recognize the name Julian Alvarez? Graves blinked. Yes, he's an alleged courier for the Menendez operation. Correct. And during your surveillance, did you ever log an interaction between Mr. Alvarez and the defendant? Graves hesitated. Not in a formal report. Morales's tone sharpened. What about informally? Did you witness Mr. Alvarez deliver 2 crates to a building associated with Mr. Menendez's business, one of which was later identified? At the daycare facility. The courtroom froze. Graves looked at Carlos. Carlos didn't blink. Graves looked at Ellie, and something in his face cracked. Yes, he said quietly. I saw the delivery. I was told not to report it. Morales stepped forward. Told by whom? Silence. Then, the defendant and his lawyer's office. I received a cash envelope the next day. It wasn't the first time. The courtroom erupted. Carlos stood up, face red with fury. "You liar!" The judge slammed the gavel. "Order! Sit down, Mr. Menendez." Graves hung his head. "I'm done lying. That little girl reminded me what happens when adults stay silent." Ellie looked up. Rachel clutched her hand. Carlos whispered something sharp to his attorney, whose expression darkened. The man looked at the bailiff, then at the door. Something was unraveling deeper than the case. This wasn't just about drugs anymore. This was a war of silence versus truth. And now, someone on the inside had flipped, as Officer Graves was escorted. Off the stand, one final glance passed between him and Carlos. Once full of control, now full of consequence. The cartel's armor wasn't just cracking, it was hemorrhaging. The storm wasn't coming, it had arrived. Officer Graves's confession had detonated like a grenade inside the courtroom, and though the judge tried to restore order, there was no putting the genie back in the bottle. The courtroom wasn't just a place for law now. It had become a live crime scene, a battlefield of betrayal and truth, and everyone inside could feel it. Carlos Menendez sat motionless, but his stillness was deceptive. Underneath, he was burning. The walls were closing in from every direction, from his former associates flipping, from law enforcement who'd once been bought, now defecting, and from a child, an innocent child, who had done more damage with one sentence than an entire task force in 3 years, and worse, his people were panicking. He glanced at his attorney, who gave a barely perceptible nod. One plan remained, a desperate one. But it would cost everything. Outside the courtroom, in the lobby, 2 men entered through the security checkpoint. They wore suits, clean-shaven. They looked like lawyers or maybe paralegals. One carried a slim black briefcase. It cleared the metal detector with ease. Security didn't blink. They should have. Inside, the trial pressed on. Rachel had stepped down from the witness stand and was now seated beside Ellie in the front row. Officer Daniels stood nearby, Rex calmly at his side but alert, ears up, nose twitching. Morales was about to call his next witness when Rex growled, low, steady, ominous. Daniels went rigid. That growl was no coincidence. Rex didn't bark for no reason. He smelled fear. He smelled intent. And he was facing the door. The courtroom double doors burst open. The 2 men in suits entered, not casually now, but fast, purposeful. One reached into his coat. Daniels didn't hesitate. "Gun!" he shouted, diving in front of Rachel and Ellie. As Rex launched forward like a bullet, screams exploded across the room. The first man raised a pistol. Rex hit him mid-chest, teeth sinking in, dragging him backward. The second man fumbled with the briefcase, opening it to reveal not papers, but a silenced submachine gun. He raised it and was shot before he could fire. One of the bailiffs, faster than anyone expected, dropped him with a single clean shot to the shoulder. The man collapsed, howling in pain. Chaos reigned. Jurors hit the floor. Spectators ducked behind benches. The judge was escorted out by marshals in seconds. Rachel wrapped Ellie in her arms and covered her with her body, shielding her as if she were made of glass. Daniels wrestled the gun from the first attacker, still pinned by Rex. The police dog refused to release his hold until ordered. Within seconds, backup officers stormed the room. Morales was white as a sheet. This was a hit. Daniels nodded, breathing heavily. They tried to kill a witness in the middle of open court. This isn't just a case anymore, it's a message. But if it was a message, it failed. Carlos stood slowly as the attackers were cuffed and dragged out. He gave no command, no protest. For the first time since the trial began, his expression broke, not with anger, with defeat. He had underestimated the system, but worse, he had underestimated a child, a dog. So mother's love, and the truth. The judge returned, pale but composed. "We will reconvene tomorrow. Mr. Menendez will remain in custody without bail. Security will be tripled." As the courtroom emptied slowly, Ellie walked beside Rex, holding his leash with one hand and her mother's fingers with the other. They passed Carlos Menendez. She didn't flinch. Rex growled once. Carlos turned away. For the first time in his life. He had been silenced, and it hadn't come from power or bullets or money, it had come from innocence. The morning sun filtered softly through the courthouse windows, but inside the air was electric, charged with the weight of days of truth and a tension that had reached its breaking point. The courtroom was packed once again. Reporters clamored for seats, camera crews set up, and jurors entered, their faces serious, their eyes tired but resolute. The trial of Carlos Menendez was nearing its end. The dramatic events of the previous day, the courtroom shooting attempt, Officer Graves's betrayal, and Ellie's unexpected testimony had shaken everyone to their core. Yet beneath the upheaval, a slow, steady truth was taking root. Judge Langford called the court to order. The prosecution rested their case, confident the jury had heard enough. The defense lawyer, drained and desperate, rose one last time. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I ask you to look beyond the noise and the emotion. This case hinges on the word of a child and the interpretation of a dog. Reason must prevail." But the jury's expressions told a different story. They had seen a mother's courage, a child's bravery, and a dog's unwavering loyalty. Rachel Parker was called back to the stand, not as a witness but as a symbol of resilience. Her voice was steady now, no longer wavering under the weight of fear. "I stood silent because I was afraid," she said, "but my daughter reminded me. And all of us, that fear should never win. Courage isn't loud, sometimes it's just a bark." She looked to Ellie, who sat quietly next to Rex. The dog's ears perked as if he understood every word. The judge instructed the jury to deliberate. Hours passed, like slow breaths. Then, the moment came. The jury filed in, their faces unreadable. The courtroom held its breath. Foreman Davis stood and announced, "We find the defendant, Carlos Menendez, guilty on all counts." A collective exhale swept the room. Tears glistened in Rachel's eyes. Ellie hugged Rex, her small frame trembling with relief. Carlos's expression was stoic, but deep inside, a storm raged. He was a man stripped bare by truth, his empire dismantled. By courage he had underestimated. The judge's gavel came down one last time. "Carlos Menendez, you will be remanded to custody. Justice has been served." Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered, many holding signs of support for Rachel and Ellie. News vans broadcast live as Rachel spoke with reporters, her voice calm but firm. "My daughter's bravery saved her life and countless others." This trial wasn't just about punishment, it was about hope, about the power of truth, no matter how small the voice. Ellie stood beside her mother, clutching Muffin tightly. Rex rested his head on her lap, a silent guardian. Then reporters asked Ellie what she thought about Rex's role in the trial. With a shy smile, Ellie said, "Rex doesn't just bark. He knows when someone's not telling the truth, and he's my best friend." Her words rippled through social media, becoming a beacon of inspiration. The story of a little girl and a police dog shaking a criminal empire became legendary weeks later. Rachel and Ellie moved to a new home far from shadows of fear. Ellie started school where she was greeted as a hero, and Rex, he was honored with a medal for bravery, the first police dog in the department's history to receive it. At the ceremony, Ellie whispered to him, "We did it, Rex. Together." As they looked out at the crowd, Rachel knew their journey wasn't over. There would be healing, rebuilding, and new battles. But for now, justice had barked loudest, and it had been heard.